Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's chief tech correspondent sitting here in London. We're here to have an interesting conversation over the next 45 minutes about reviewing the last week's EU-US Trade and Tech Council. Luckily, we have two amazing speakers who are at the event last week in the Arctic Circle in Sweden. So before we get going, I just wanted to introduce Director Helena, who is from the National Security Council at the White House in charge of technology and national security. And then we've got Alejandro Caínzos from Margrethe Vestager's cabinet, focused also on transatlantic tech issues, among other things. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Let's just dive in. There's a lot to cover, and from everything from chips to AI to China. But Helena, I was going to turn to you, then to Alejandro, just to kick us off. This is now the fourth event that we've had between the US and EU on a variety of trade and tech issues. That relationship has inherently grown, and as people get to know each other, etc. But from your perspective, before we get into the nitty gritty, can you give us maybe one takeaway from the meeting last week that you either surprised you or thought was a win for both sides?
Thanks so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you said, we were in Sweden last week and just got back on Thursday evening. I think what struck me from the discussion was, we've had so few opportunities for principal level cabinet members to really engage in frank and open, prolonged discussion over 2 days that really dive at the heart of the tech issues and the trade issues in our transatlantic partnership. And to do so not only with each other and the teams with each other, but with stakeholders from both of our sides. And so I think, I don't like to frame things in terms of wins, because I think in a partnership, it's a give and take, and there really is not a one-off win. But I really think that you can see that the technical cooperation and the staff level cooperation that sort of underpins some of the foundational aspects of this work are leading to real results, and that we are able to, at a very high level, have very open and honest discussions about all of these aspects of our relationship. So
openness and honesty. Alejandro, I presume you're going to say the same thing. So, in terms of, again, an outcome from last week's event, can you, before we get into some of the detail from the European side, what was one of the successful outcomes that Helena mentions?
So you were right to presume I was going to say the same thing. Indeed, I think probably this fourth meeting, it's fair to say, was the most productive so far. And I think it just speaks to the fact that we're at a stage of the relationship where I think most of the, let's say, theoretical political policy alignment has already happened, and we're now talking about concrete projects, concrete results. From that perspective, we're quite happy with the results on standardization, on semiconductors, on connectivity, including international connectivity, and also I think we've laid out some pretty ambitious projects for the near future, including on artificial intelligence as well as on 6G, for example. So it's kind of a snowball that keeps rolling. The more we get done, I think the more we see that there are more things we can do together.
Helena, I suppose I can't help but start off with some of the things around AI that Alejandro mentions, most because, in the last 6 months, ChatGPT has become a thing that even my grandmother knows. And therefore it's, something that both sides need to sort of look and see to be seen to do something. There was a discussion right at the end, and this came up in the press conference, around some sort of voluntary code on AI that was like a little bit amorphous for my liking, but that seemed to be a sense of, beyond some of the metrics and the AI roadmap that's built into the TTC, like another level of cooperation, or even development of some sort of voluntary standard. From the US side, what does that look like? Because there's been a variety of executive orders from the White House in recent months. There's obviously things going on in Congress that is obviously another branch of the US government. But in terms of where the US government is looking to build ties with both Europe and other, like-minded partners, what happens next in terms of that AI work within the TTC?
And thanks, Mark. And as you rightly pointed out, a lot of this really harkens back to the work that's been going on in AI in the TTC since the very beginning. It's always been a thread. It's always been something that's been worked on. In this next instantiation, we've agreed to include generative AI focus within the work of the technical work between NIST and counterparts. But as you mentioned, I think at this TTC, you could see our leaders really agree on the urgency of this moment to address some of the new opportunities and the risks that are posed by generative AI. I think the conversation really benefited as well from the very robust stakeholder engagement that happened in Luleå. We heard from a number of companies from the US and the EU. It's a very, very important discussion. So I think we're really working to develop the right new approaches for responsible uses that include these kinds of voluntary principles, code of conduct, and commitments, as well as a longer-term need for formal regulation. But we really aim to come to a common view, and I think this is part of that discussion. I heard in meeting sort of tasking to really move together quickly on this. We're also mindful that there's already ongoing work within the G7 process, as well as the OECD and elsewhere. So it's going to be an international issue. We're going to need to work with all partners on this, but I think the US-EU TTC is really a significant platform for us to advance the work that we're doing.
As Helena mentions, Alejandro, there's a lot going on from the sort of OECD principles to, frankly, what China's doing in its own domestic sphere on AI. Within Europe, there's the AI Act, right? And, your counterparts in the Spanish presidency coming up are looking to get that done, at least by the end of the year. In terms of international cooperation, how does that fit in with Europe's own sort of legislative track that's coming down the pike?
Exactly. So as Helena mentioned, I think all of these things are happening in parallel. So we are working on legislation. We proposed this already some time ago, and we have the ambition to try to finalize the negotiations of the AI Act by end of this year. But even in the best case scenario, given our legal system and the transition periods involved, we're talking about real application, tangible application in about 3 years from now, give or take. And of course, we are seeing how generative AI in particular is growing at exponential rate. And that means that we need to find stopgap measures in the meantime. This is why I think this was very present in the discussions in Luleå, and the ministers concluded on this commitment to work together towards voluntary commitments from the AI developers that would, of course, need to involve, towards this code of conduct, we would need to involve stakeholders, not just the AI developers, but of course the civil society, independent academics, etc. And as Helena said, with our like-minded partners, there is this commitment from the leaders at the Hiroshima summit of last month called the Hiroshima AI process, with a deadline end of this year. So we want to see how we can, let's say, merge those discussions with this first bilateral attempt coming out of Luleå in order to get as quickly as possible and with as many partners as possible and as concrete as possible. So quite a high level of ambition, as you can imagine. And just to finalize, of course, this is also complementary with the work that you mentioned at the beginning that we've been doing already for some time in the TTC on the joint roadmap on AI, which is very focused on definitions, terminology, metrics, measuring tools, etc., which will be crucial for any company on both sides of the Atlantic to comply, whether it's legislation or voluntary codes. You will need these technical tools to comply down the road.
I don't want to belay too much on AI because there's a lot more to cover. But Helena, just finally on this point, President Biden has made it very clear that something has to be done, and everyone from Sam Altman from OpenAI to Brad Smith from Microsoft has also called for some sort of regulation in some ilk. I know bills and laws come from Congress, not the White House technically, but in terms of a non-binding voluntary code of conduct, if I'm a citizen, doesn't sound that like it has many teeth. And as I get it, I'm a technology reporter with a political bias, so I'm always going to look for policy and regulation because that's my beat. But is it enough, do you think? I mean, does the White House or Congress or the US government as a whole need to do more than some sort of binding, some non-binding voluntary code or the variety of executive orders that have come out recently?
It's a very good point. I think that what we're trying to do here is really take a deliberate approach to understanding these new AI capabilities to ensure that our voluntary commitments are really anchored in technical realities that can be meaningfully implemented. And I think part of the challenge, as you all know, with ChatGPT and others, is that it is very new for policymakers to kind of understand and come to grips with how to actually manage it. So I think this is going to be the hard work that we're going to have to do going forward. Whether it's enough, I think that's a very loaded term. I do think that we need to start with this to understand the spaces before we can go full on for sort of formal regulation here.
Good. And finally, Alejandro, give us some details. Like, what does the voluntary code look like?
Well, it would be very disrespectful for me towards Helena to give you details that her and I haven't yet agreed, given that it's meant to be a joint endeavor. But I think you will not be surprised about some of the elements that are there in terms of the principles of what you would expect to feature in such a code of conduct. I think what matters is that it needs to be sufficiently robust to be implementable and for developers to be accountable to it. And I think that's what we need to get to. I think our boss is committed to trying to get a draft together in the next weeks, plural. So you need to be patient.
Patience, unfortunately, is not a virtue I have, but I appreciate that. Helena, I'm somewhat skeptical of the TTC process, mostly because I see the US and the EU as frenemies more than anything else, because there are, very much like-minded partners, but there's obviously economic and political disagreements on many things. But what did strike me about this TTC was, on some of the wonkery that I kind of dig, semiconductors, telecommunications, there did seem to be greater collaboration and cooperation than even in the previous meetings. What struck me also was on the semiconductors, the idea of trying to share information on each other's subsidy packages to avoid, the Intels and TSMCs of this world trying to play off one another to get the most amount of money, frankly. Can you give us a little bit of detail what that entails? Like, what does that information sharing look like to make sure that the US CHIPS Act gets its bang for its buck?
Yeah, I think that is, well, firstly, I'll start with your skepticism of the TTC. I think it's something that we have heard from some of our stakeholders. Often there's this question for what are the deliverables? What are the headline things that you've delivered? And I think it's a very natural question. We as human beings are very, inclined to ask for that top line thing. But if you kind of think about the process of TTC, it's actually every 6-month cycle. To develop this sort of very big splashy headline, that's kind of an unsustainable trajectory, right? I think it doesn't actually enable or allow for substantive real work that takes time and bakes over years. And so what's been happening since Pittsburgh, since the launch, is the sort of gradual evolution of TTC, and you're now seeing some of those deliverables really come out, and some of it is not as visible as you mentioned. What does coordination look like? And I think one of the things that really has been developed through this mechanism is very top-line channels to each other to make sure that each other are not surprised, that we are now, talking, coordinating around activities on both of our sides as we implement the CHIPS Act here, and as we think about the various research and development activities and the supply chain considerations. So I think, what does it look like? We'll be looking at how we coordinate more on supply chains. Obviously, we have a CHIPS office here that is very active internationally and working with counterparts in Europe. What we'd really like to do is also increase research collaboration from our NSTC and IMEC. So I think these are sort of the forward trajectory. But again, you talk about what is this a headline? I really think this is ongoing technical work that unfortunately makes for sort of the dull the dull newspaper headline, but I think is really substantive work that is very valuable.
Yeah, well, if I pitch a story about sort of technical work on sort of telecommunication standards, it's not going to get a green light from my editor. So I appreciate that. Alejandro, on the R&D stuff, there's some interesting things around quantum that's in the final statement. Could you give a sense of what that looks like? Again, maybe not just to quantum, but also the R&D that is trying to be developed between both sides.
Yeah, so one of the things we realized maybe in hindsight is that we didn't have, when we set up TTC, let's say, and a specific vehicle for R&D. So R&D was kind of spread out in the different buckets of what we're doing. But as we've made progress, and a lot of it, as Helena says, is organic progress in different areas, we see the R&D piece popping up substantially in all of these buckets. So you were just talking about semiconductors. So one of the things we've agreed on now, in addition to information exchange about our respective programs, and that falls into this much wider coordination of our CHIPS Acts, is to drive R&D together to find an alternative to PFAS in semiconductor supply chains, which is extremely important in order to ensure that this crucial technology is safe, as safe as possible for health. Then you have, as you mentioned, the Quantum Task Force, which is quite an ambitious project because it's the first time that we're going to be dealing with cooperation in an emerging technology in a vertical way. So that includes everything in that technology, from the R&D to the standardization, all the way up potentially to export control. So you have let's say a full spectrum discussion through this task force, and one of the first pieces would be to identify what are the respective barriers to cooperation and R&D, and to try to solve them. If you mention R&D, I think I need to mention 6G, because that was one of the, I think, biggest deliverables of this meeting, which is our 6G outlook. So here, I think a very strong commitment to say that we will, run faster if we run together on this, and we will have both a common vision between governments of how we want to get to 6G, including for R&D and international standards, as well as an industry roadmap. So we want the researchers, the companies on both sides to get together and try to join forces, because it's clear that the more critical mass you get, the faster you can advance.
It's giving steps, Alejandro. We get to 6G in a minute, but I suppose we'll jump into it now. And Helena, to you, when I look at the 6G outlook, it's hard not to look at, the underlying issue of China playing into this, because of the role that, Chinese telecom equipment makers like Huawei have played in both in 5G with their R&D, and now, whenever 6G comes in the next decade, the role that China and Chinese companies will play. My cynical view is it's easier for the US and Europe to, my words, gang up or collaborate, if that's maybe a more positive way of looking at it, on standards to push back when the Chinese come to sort of the global standards bodies to push their claim for this. Am I wrong to think that any greater cooperation between the US and Europe on 6G standards is kind of plays into the hands that of trying to push back China and what it's trying to do on the global stage?
I think that what we've done across the spectrum, not just 6G, but all of these critical and emerging technologies, is really think about how we come at this from our foundation of shared values, right? And so I think cooperation on standards and helping those values shape the sort of global rules around how technology is deployed. These are things that we actively think about and are sort of baked into the 6G outlook that you mentioned. So yes, it does cover these guiding principles in our common transatlantic vision on what 6G should look like, and that it should be open, secure, and trusted.
But just coming back to the China question, there were two digital infrastructure projects announced within the TTC, one in Costa Rica, one in the Philippines, I believe. Both of that is based on, again, from my reading, providing US and EU funding for both 5G and cybersecurity projects. I look at who else funds such projects, and the Chinese state banks have a role to play with Huawei, ZTE, etc. How much of this is about trying to create a transatlantic relationship so you can offer an alternative to that Chinese funding model?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've always thought that sort of having a diversity of suppliers is an important thing. It's part of our supply chain resiliency broadly. And so, yes, I think this 6G cooperation is an attempt to provide additional options, additional vendors, really push the frontier for where the R&D can go, and then to bring our industry alongside.
Alejandro, from the European perspective, there are, as we were in Sweden last week, there was a very large Swedish telecom equipment maker and a Finnish one that play big roles in this space. What does international cooperation on standards mean for Europe when, frankly, a lot of that standards work is already being done by European companies?
So I think our companies are very supportive of international cooperation for standardization, including towards 6G. I think it's finding the right balance between, on the one hand, working with those partners that are closest to us in order to push the buck as fast as possible, and that's what we're trying to do through the 6G outlook. But at the same time, ensuring that standardization is international in nature, including all countries. I think this is very important because at the end of the day, you need to have international standards. That's what guarantees a level playing field. That's what guarantees interoperability. I think the oldest ones among us, we remember how that at some point you had to change phones when you were traveling to a different continent. So nobody wants to go back to that. So we need to, in a way, yes, cooperate with our most trusted partners to go faster when it comes to R&D, but also keep that international standardization perspective.
But just on the current standards, there's been a big US-led push around so-called Open RAN, mostly to allow some of the digital service providers in the US, the cloud providers, et cetera, to piggyback on the back of 5G infrastructure to get into that market. These are my words, there are some European companies who haven't liked that very much because it puts them at a potentially competitive disadvantage. When it comes to 6G, whenever that does happen, how do you balance the need for those international standards while also, frankly, protecting some of the European companies who don't want to have such open standards out there?
So I think those are two different questions, right? So one thing is the deployment of existing 5G networks and open architectures within it. And there, I think there is an open discussion of how mature that technology is. And here, I think we all agree, EU, US, that the trend is towards virtualization of networks. But we want to make sure that the security aspects of that are solid. On the other hand, we in Europe, we leave it to the market to decide. So we're not actively promoting one technology or the other. We let the market decide which of the kind of the more traditional architectures or Open RAN will be taken up by the operators going forward. So we're monitoring that process while at the same time encouraging the R&I needed to make sure that open architecture virtualized networks are as secure and as energy efficient as possible going forward. So that's one set of one set of considerations. The other set is 6G and how we get to the next generation. And there, I think that there is industry consensus on the fact that there will be openness from the beginning, from the outset. But there, we want to also make sure that this openness goes throughout the supply chain, because as networks get virtualized, of course, we need to look at openness in the cloud. We need to look at openness all throughout the 6G supply chain. And this is one of the principles we agreed with in the 6G outlook.
Helena, I feel like I'm doing a whistle-stop tour of the TTC statement, so forgive me for bouncing around a bunch of topics. But the one thing that also I saw was some quite strong language around foreign interference, both from Russia and China and their activities within Latin America and Africa. From a US perspective, what does that look like? I read the statement, it talks about greater information sharing, standardization of what an interference operation looks like. But in terms of what's happening in the here and now, and I checked this morning, and there's an ongoing Russian disinfo campaign in Latin America based around the potential Ukraine counteroffensive going on as we speak. that is still alive and kicking on a bunch of the platforms. So in terms of, what the US is looking to get out of this, can you give us some details?
Yeah, and I think that this work within the TTC is, again, pointing to the foundation of shared values, right? So it's very different from the discussion that we're having around quantum, for example, or semiconductors. It really is about where we want to go together. And so, being able to share information in a structured way, I think is going to be very important so that we can take action when we need to. I think these joint principles on the protection and empowerment of children and youth in online environments is also incredibly essential, and I think something that's very, very valuable for our two countries to work together, as well as protecting human rights defenders online, right? And so, as we continue to do this work, we'll continue to work with all of our stakeholders to make sure that we're really meeting the moment here. I understand that these threats are ongoing and in the here and now, but that's sort of the value of the cooperation that's ongoing, right? So we have these direct lines of connection, and they're already and actively still engaged in information exchange here.
Just for the audience, just to give we're not getting lost in the weeds, because I reread the statement this morning, and I'm not sure everyone else did. There are three components to this. There is, greater cooperation within foreign interference, specifically calling out China and Russia. And then there's a second element in the final statement looking at platforms and accountability, one looking at protection and empowerment of kids online, and the second one around data access for outside researchers. On that last point on data access, what does that look like? Because the Europeans are going to be, through their Digital Services Act, coming through with some sort of regime early next year. I could argue, and I have talked to many US researchers who say, well, my European counterparts get access to important information to do my job. Where's my access? I mean, can we see something similar on the US side based on these principles?
So I think this is going to be the hard work that we're going to need to undertake in the next 6 months. I think more broadly around digital governance as well. Part of the thing that enables greater cooperation on quantum, on AI, are around data flows, right? And so how we can really work together in this field is going to be very, very important.
Alejandro, I'm going to play Team Europe here for a second, and I read those accountability platform principles, and they look very similar to what the DSA looks like. Again, I think sometimes the Brussels effect is overplayed, because other people have good ideas too. But how much is that platform accountability a so-called win for Europe if the US side is at least signing up to sort of those type of principles?
I think it's a win for minors, and it's a win for transparency. And in a way, if you look at President Biden's op-ed from beginning of this year, you will find alignment with that as well. So I think it's also in a way speaks to the value of the TTC, that through this relationship we are talking through these issues. We understand each other. There was a tendency some time ago to wrongly describe EU platform legislation as anti-American or something like that. Now you see that there is more and more alignment in terms of what we want to achieve, but also concrete projects, as you've mentioned, for instance, on data, when researchers access to data, concrete projects that will see direct benefits also for US policy goals of our legislation. So this is, I think, some of the things we're looking at in terms of how to leverage the positive effects of the DSA when it comes to improving transparency and accountability of platforms. We don't want to be jealous about this. We want to make sure that everything that promotes more accountability, more transparency is a net positive, also if it comes from US-based researchers. So we're looking at into that when we think about our delegated acts in the DSA, how we can promote this kind of trusted information exchange, keeping in mind what the end goal is. And the same, by the way, can be said about protection of minors. I mean, I don't see a reason just because our co-legislator is faster or more able to finish laws than the US Congress. I don't see that should be a reason for platforms to protect European minors and not American ones.
Helena, I'm an impatient person, unfortunately, and I've already turned my attention to whenever the meeting is going to be. The next TTC is going to happen sometime, I presume, in December. If you want to tell us where, I'm all ears. I look at the rundown of this summit, and we've got semiconductors, we've got quantum AI, platform accountability. There's also sustainable trade is mentioned on the trade side. I believe we're maybe close to some sort of deal on the critical raw materials. There's been an issue for the Europeans with the US legislation that is, in the foreseeable future. I'm not sure when we might have that. But for the next round, I mean, where would you like to take? Where's the White House looking to take this? I mean, what do you see as a win for the 10 working groups that are now scurrying away and doing the hard work over the next 6 months?
So, I mean, I laugh when you say you're an impatient person, because I think we're all very, very impatient and want to see the fruits of all of this labor really come to light. And I think, as I said, you're starting to see that. Frankly, Pittsburgh was about setting that foundation, and since then it's sort of evolved. We are thinking about the most efficient and practical way to bring all of this cooperation forward. I think, it may make sense to think through how we can make things a little bit more streamlined. I don't know when the next TTC will be. It will be in the United States later this year, but I'm sure you'll find out soon enough. Politico seems to get quite a lot of information very, very quickly. But just in terms of what we really hope to see at the next TTC, really is to see this concrete cooperation taken to the next level, right? We announced a lot of things. We hope to be able to announce some of the results, or at least early results of some of that work. Some of these will be on longer versus shorter time frames, but regardless, I really think that in each of these areas around quantum, around AI, semiconductors, there will be good things to report.
It's hard not to look past next year's election cycle and the effect that may have on a variety of things, both domestically and internationally. What kind of assurances can you give, if any, to your European counterparts that whoever takes over the White House or President Biden continues, depending on what happens with the result next year, that the TTC is here to stay? So
I can't prejudge any outcome. However, what I can say is that a strong transatlantic relationship is always going to be important. And so, the channels that we have, both from NSC to the cabinet, as well as from agency leadership to agency leadership. I mean, most of the people that are working on TTC are civil servants, right? And so the memory will stay. I think the cooperation that, as I said again, is pretty technical and in the weeds. That is worthwhile work that will need to keep ongoing, whether or not it's under this particular umbrella or another. But I think in some form or fashion, there will be some forum where we're going to need to have really open discussions about trade and technology.
Technical and in the weeds is my jam, so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next. Alejandro, to you, we have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act coming into play very soon. The AI Act for Europe may be done potentially by the end of the year. The Digital Governance Act, the Data Act. There's a lot coming on within the EU. There's an EU-India TTC because we can't have enough trade and tech councils apparently. In terms of capacity and focus for the Commission in this work, what are you hoping to get out of the next 6 months before whenever the next TTC with the US happens?
I think Helena is right that a lot of these areas we have will have their kind of natural progression. So some of it will happen organically. I think semiconductors is the best example. By now we have such a close working relationship at all levels of staff that I'm confident that the cooperation will move forward either way. But there will be some areas where we will need particular political attention and steer, I expect, and in some cases just because of the urgency. So I think on AI, I think the urgency on generative AI is quite obvious. So I'd expect that we will be paying close attention to moving that forward. And I expect also on quantum that we will pay attention to moving that forward. I think those two are clear examples. We want to continue, by the way, the cooperation on international projects on connectivity. We've had announced 2 now. There were 2 in the previous one, so already 4. But we need to continue because, as you say, this is high stakes, and by coming together, we have much better offers that can compete better with some of the offers that are out there. So yeah, I would mention those 3 areas possibly as continued areas of focus. And of course, I'm sitting here on the tech side. There's a whole trade area, which my colleagues from the other side of the corridor are leading, and there I think we have high expectations to try to close off some of the open processes, whether it's on critical minerals or on steel that are ongoing by this fall.
Yeah, sometimes it's easy to forget that technology isn't the be and end all, and maybe fighting climate change is a pretty important topic too. We're wrapping up, so I'm going to ask you both the same question, just to sort of finish off, to frame this a little bit. In terms of where the TTC sits now versus where it began 2 years ago, I get that now the principals have spent some time with each other, they've had dinner. I presume there's flurries of Signal/WhatsApp/ text message going around, to build that relationship. But from what we saw in Luleå last week, from where it was in Pittsburgh, when it began, what is the thing that's changed the most, do you think, for both of you? Helena, I'll start with you, then to Alejandro.
I mean, I think, as you say, when they launched in Pittsburgh, it was really about, what are the shared principles, what are the shared values. I think what changed, was frankly Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and our second TTC took place in the shadow of that in Saclay, and really that was where you saw a lot of that export control cooperation come to the fore, which was really built from just people getting to know each other and building those relationships and being able to act very quickly. And so now we have this focus on concrete projects and moving those things forward. The biggest thing that's changed, I think, is with increased communication and trust, really results in the ability to have those frank and open discussions on areas where we may not fully agree, right? On areas where we need to work more together and work through things. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that's changed is, the real partnership that we have here, and the ability to drive forward outcomes.
And Alejandro, to you.
Yeah, I would agree with Helena's answer. I think there will always be exogenous factors that will affect the TTCs depending on what's happening. Obviously, the war was the biggest one. You see also the energy fallout coming out of that war that had also an impact of our last meeting. Now we had generative AI popping in. Who knows what will come in for the next one. So I think the ability of the TTC to respond to urgent needs is a key. It's a key part of this forum being successful. And the other key part, and that has changed dramatically, is indeed the level of trust. You see after sitting through 4 of these meetings how the nature of the conversations just change when they know each other so well. As you say, Signal messages, they've been together on so many occasions. You as a civil servant, you write your speaking notes, but then the notes go to the side and they're just 2 people speaking at each other, understanding each other so quickly, and that makes a massive difference. And it makes us much closer to results, of course.
I think we're going to call it an end here. So I'm Mark Scott, Politico's Chief Tech Correspondent, and one shameless plug that I do write a weekly transatlantic tech newsletter called Digital Bridge, if you do want to know what's going on with the TTC ahead of time. And with that, Helena and Alejandro, thank you so much this morning and this afternoon for joining us, and hopefully we can reconvene after the next TTC. Thanks.